So thank you all for coming to my lecture today. I really wanted to talk about Boston museums and art in Boston because Boston just has some wonderful art, and although a lot of it's in some museums you may have heard of, a lot of it is in kind of smaller, more unusual museums. So I'll be talking about all kinds of museums here today. And I've always been really drawn to art. I actually graduated with a minor in visual art, and my favorite thing has always been portraits. I love portraiture. I love drawing and painting portraits and looking at them. I just find them very interesting. So I thought today I would show you 3 famous portraits that hang in Boston that you may have seen before or heard of, and may not have seen before or heard of, and just talk about the backstories behind these, how they relate to the city. So to begin with, we'll talk about Boston's largest, most well-known museum, the MFA. So raise your hand if you've been to the MFA already. So it's like a good amount of you. If you haven't, I definitely recommend that you visit. It's really easy to get to. All you need to do is get on the B line, make sure you get on the E line, and take the E line out to the MFA stop. Once you get off at the MFA stop, you walk to your left, you'll see the museum. It's right there. You actually go in the back entrance when you get in that way. The front of the museum has these weird huge baby head sculptures, but you won't see them. But they're worth checking out anyway because they're a little unusual. So I'm going to be talking about a portrait that's hanging in the American wing, which is a new addition to the museum. They just added it a couple of years ago, but it's really large and a really excellent addition to the museum. It spans from colonial American art, so when America was still a British colony in the late 1700s, to contemporary art, and it's got all sorts of things like painting, sculpture, video installations even, but I'll be talking about a very specific portrait by someone whose name might be familiar to you, but I bet you don't know who they really were, and that's John Singleton Copley. So raise your hand if you've been to Copley Square. So a lot of you, where the public library is in Back Bay. It's kind of the heart of Back Bay. But for a long time, I didn't know, even though I would go there, who John Singleton Copley really was. And then once the American wing opened up, I found out that he was the most well-known painter in early colonial America. He was quite famous in England as well. And he was really the guy to go to if you wanted your portrait done. He was very well known. So I'll be talking about a portrait of someone else whose name might be familiar to you, especially if you've been to Copley Square, and that's Nicholas Boylston. So I think probably a lot of us have been on Boylston Street, been shopping, been to some restaurants over there, right? Yeah? I know I'm there a lot. But who was Nicholas Boylston? So here's John Singleton Copley's portrait of Nicholas Boylston. It was painted before the American Revolution in 1769. And I chose it because I think it's kind of unusual. I think it's kind of a weird-looking portrait, actually. And so it's very intriguing to me for that reason. So just take a look at the portrait for a little while and think about not knowing anything about Nicholas Boylston, what can you guess about him just by looking at the painting? What do you think his job may have been? What do you think his social status in Boston was? Do you think he was rich? Do you think he was poor? So how about you just turn to the person next to you for a minute, say hi to your neighbors, and talk a little bit about who this guy could be. So everyone turn around. Just talk about it for a minute. Or to me, whichever. Yeah.
Because of the clothes. He was painted by
All right. Do we have some guesses? You guys kind of talked a little bit about who you think he may have been. So now we're going to find out who actually was Nicholas Boylston, and how can you tell who he was just by looking at this painting. So, as you may have been able to guess, probably pretty easily, he was a very wealthy man, and he made his money, he lived in Boston, he made his money owning a shipping company that would import tea and glass and fabrics from back and forth from England to the colonies. And around this time, things were very heated, particularly having to do with importation and shipping, because the British had taxed many goods in America, and many of the people you may have heard of as the Founding Fathers strongly disagreed with this. But Boylston actually needed a relationship with Britain in order to maintain his wealth. So he was a supporter of the British, not of the American Revolution. And when the American colonies instituted a non-importation agreement saying that they would no longer trade with England, that they would only get their goods from America, Boylston disagreed with this because that's how he made all this money that you can kind of see displayed in the picture. And Sam Adams, who you may have heard of if you've taken the Freedom Trail or had a beer out in Boston, Sam Adams called him an enemy of his own country, which I think is kind of funny since we walk down his street almost every day in Boston. But in his time, he was kind of seen as an enemy of what Boston really stands for. But he died before the revolution, so that may be a reason why he's not so famous, because he never really had the chance to get too heavily involved. So what does Copley put in the painting that would have allowed viewers, both contemporary with Boylston and in our time, to guess who Copley was? Well, one of the things is the chairs. He puts in the painting a Chippendale chair that Boylston's sitting in, and this would have been a very expensive, very modern and trendy sort of furniture to own at the time. So that's a clue that this man has lots of money and wants to display it. And here's what the Chippendale chair looks like. It's not that unusual to us now, but having no arms seems uncomfortable to me, but it was very popular and trendy back then. Another thing is that Boylston is leaning his arm up on a stack of ledgers, which he would have used to record his business dealings with England. So it's a reference to how he's made the money that you can see displayed in the picture. And in the first rendering of this painting, which is owned by Harvard, this is actually the second, more refined edition. Copley included a ship in the background, but did not put it in this one. So he may have removed that because it was a very heated time having to do with shipping, and it may have been a little bit too explicit of a reference and made people a little upset, like Sam Adams at the time. So my big question about this painting is, what the heck is he wearing? I think that's what really stood out to me at first as being so strange. That hat, the big robe, it's not how you're used to seeing colonial men. If you think about people you see on American Money, or like George Washington, Ben Franklin, the big names, the Founding Fathers, the people who we see out in Faneuil Hall walking around trying to give you tours of the Freedom Trail, they don't look like this much, do they? And one of the biggest reasons that Boylston looks so different from how we're used to seeing colonial men is that this painting, although the setting isn't very clear, you can't really tell what kind of room he's in. It's private and it's a relaxed setting, so he's not dressed up like a public official like we're used to seeing early Americans looking like, in their buttoned up coats and their wigs. And so he's wearing a heavy, expensive robe, and this odd little cap that's actually called a negligee cap, and that was to cover his shaved head. So actually, many of the men that we think of when we think about the American Revolution would have looked a lot like Boylston when they were at home too, but we just don't see them in those settings because they were portrayed as public officials, and what he wanted to show was not that he was a public official, but that he had money, lots of money. So in the painting, Boylston gets portrayed at home just so he can really show off to viewers exactly what he could afford for the really rich clothing, the velvet hats. So that's just kind of an introduction to the way that portraiture can include some details that allow you to really, even if you don't know who the person is at all, you can figure out a pretty good idea. So do you think that just looking at the painting when you were talking earlier, you kind of got some of what it was about even before you really knew about Boylston? Nod, no. Yeah, something of it. You could tell he was rich at least, and that is really the main point he wanted to get across. So moving on, talk next about the Harvard University Fogg Museum. Harvard actually has 3 small art museums that are not so well known but have some really famous art in them. There's the Fogg Museum, which is European and American art. The Arthur M. Sackler Museum, which has Asian art, and the Bush Rising Museum, which has Germanic art, and it's very easy to get to. Again, all you have to do is get on the Red Line, get off at the Harvard T-stop, walk through Harvard Yard to Quincy Street, and there's the museum. But unfortunately, I realize that it's closed for renovation right now, but should be open in the future. So if you're here for a while in Boston, you can still get to see it. And Harvard also has many other interesting small museums that I'd recommend anyway, like their Science Museum. So this is my favorite painting in the Fogg Museum. It's an artist that I'm sure many of you are fairly familiar with, have at least heard of before, Vincent van Gogh. So unlike Copley, who was very, very famous in his own time, but we don't really know a whole lot about him generally now, Van Gogh was not famous even a little bit in his own time, but is now one of the most loved artists in the entire world. And so his self-portrait dedicated to Paul Gauguin, which was painted over 100 years after the Copley portrait that we looked at, hangs in the Fogg Museum. So take a little while, turn again to your partners, and just discuss, compared to Copley's portrait, what sorts of things does Van Gogh seem to be concerned with here? Is it similar at all? Is it completely different? And what details in the painting lead you to guess this? So go ahead, talk amongst yourselves for a minute.
But the paint itself
All right. So who, or not who, because we know who this is, it's a self-portrait, but what Van Gogh is actually trying to say through this portrait and why he wanted to say it. So I think there are two really important ideas in understanding this painting, and one of them, of course, is who's Paul Gauguin? So if you have a portrait dedicated to him, it's probably pretty important to know about that. So raise your hand if you've heard of the painter Paul Gauguin before. So a good amount of people. So he was another post-impressionist, which is the group of painters that Van Gogh and he and other French artists of the time belonged to. And he painted this painting in response to a painting that was sent to him by Gauguin called Self-Portrait Les Miserables. So we can just take a look at that for a minute and I'll come back to this slide. So this was initially sent to Van Gogh, and then as a reaction to this painting, Van Gogh sent Gauguin back his self-portrait. So what did he see in Gauguin's self-portrait that made him respond with this? Well, Gauguin was trying to compare himself to the main character of the novel and now the movie starring Hugh Jackman and Anne Hathaway, Les Mis, and that would be Jean Valjean, who's the main character, and Gauguin really saw him, Jean Valjean, the character, as being a man who's misunderstood by society, who is trying to do the right thing but can't because other people are holding him back and keeping him trapped. And Gauguin saw himself as an artist in a similar way, that he was against society, that he was misunderstood. And he wrote this in a letter to Van Gogh that went along with the painting, talking about how he filled it with these bright colors to represent his passion for art, but also his despair that he was so misunderstood and had to stand alone. Whereas Van Gogh had a very, very different vision of being an artist. He really wanted to create a community and a collective of people in the south of France, in the town Arles, where he was living, and trying to set up a house where many similarly minded artists could come and work together. And he deeply admired Gauguin, and he wanted him to come be the leader of the entire group. Van Gogh didn't want to be the leader, he just wanted to set the groundwork, and then they could all work together to find a truth in art and expression. So he was very actually discouraged to receive this painting. He thought that it was deeply sad and very hopeless that Gauguin would see himself as being against society and cut off from other people, when what Van Gogh really wanted was to create a group together. So in reaction to the sadness and despair that he saw in Gauguin, he painted himself as what he believed was looking like a Japanese monk. So he wanted to emphasize, through being a Japanese monk, the idea of a brotherhood and a group that could all work together. So I think that's why there's kind of a severity in his posture and the face, because he wanted to emphasize kind of the religious order. And that leads me to the second important thing about this painting, which is Van Gogh's relationship with Japanese art. So, like many post-impressionists, but possibly more than any of them, Van Gogh was really influenced by and really just deeply loved Japanese art. It was fairly new, I think, in Europe to be looking at Western art, and it really informed a lot of his own choices in painting. And he actually said, I have a quote here, he wrote many, many letters to his brother Theo, and most of what we know from really the inside of Van Gogh's head comes from these letters that he wrote to his brother, who was really his only main supporter during his lifetime. And he wrote to Theo, And you cannot study Japanese art, it seems to me, without becoming much gayer and happier, and we must return to nature in spite of our education and our work in a world of convention. So to him, Japanese art symbolized freedom from this society that Gauguin thought was dragging him down and that he had to stand apart from. It was a way of escaping. So he emphasized that he was a Japanese monk in this. And he was also very influenced by the colors in Japanese art with the clear, bright colors. And he actually, although clearly Van Gogh never went to Japan, he settled in the south of France because he imagined that the strong, bright light in the south of France was completely identical to the light in Japan. And that's what allowed Japanese painters to paint with these bright colors. So it's probably not so true, but that's what he believed at least. And for Van Gogh, color was so incredibly important, so much that it was spiritual for him. It was almost like a religion, to be using as much color to express things as possible. So he actually said in another letter to Theo, "And in a picture, I want to say something comforting as music is comforting. I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal which the halo used to symbolize and which we seek to convey by the actual radiance and vibration of the coloring." So I included these two details in here so you can really get a sense of what it meant to him to say radiance and vibration of the coloring, because for Van Gogh, you can see almost a vibration, the way he paints those brush strokes and has the colors against one another. It could almost swirl or move around. So I think that really gives a good sense of how alive he felt color could be and how alive he felt it was in Japanese art that he wanted to transmit into his own work.
Do you guys know the word halo? He uses there. Can you explain that?
Sure. A halo is the circle of heavenly light that you would see on someone like an angel. So, the circle above their head. Or if you think of Renaissance art or medieval art and how it's always people that have the big gold circles behind their heads. And that's what a halo is. So to him, color was almost the same as what it used to represent to paint someone with a halo behind their heads. So, moving on to the last museum I'm going to talk about today. It's an extremely interesting, really unusual museum located here in Boston. It's right near the MFA, so if you're not too tired from exploring the MFA, it's easy to make a trip over to the Isabella Stewart Gardener Museum. Like I said, it's an extremely unique museum. There is not another museum like it in the world. And actually, it's home to the most famous art theft in history about 20 years ago. So the museum is unique because every single aspect of the museum was planned personally by Isabella Stewart Gardener, who was a woman who lived in the late 1800s in America, primarily. And she was a very intellectual, forceful woman, very atypical for her times, not like other women in Boston. And she would go around the world collecting art. And she decided that she needed to build a museum. She was extremely wealthy, and she needed to build a museum to collect all of this art that she had, or to store all of the art and to display all of the art that she had collected throughout the years. So she constructed a museum that was based off of Venetian palazzos, which she really admired because Venice was her favorite city to go to. So there's a Venetian palazzo right in Fenway, actually. And Fenway was also a good choice for her because she loved the Red Sox. So she could go to her museum, catch a game. It's very convenient. So something very strange about the Isabella Stewart Gardener Museum is the way that the art is displayed. It's kind of all over the place a little bit. It's on odd parts of the walls. Some paintings are really close together. It's not the typical museum experience where you just walk through and there's a painting and you walk to the next one. They're on top. They're kind of layered. Some are in weird spots that don't really get very much light to them all the time. But that doesn't matter, because she said in her will that the collection, the permanent collection, could never be changed. So if anyone were to try to move around the art that she displayed very carefully in this museum, the entire collection of the museum would actually just have to get auctioned off, and there would be no more museum. So it's really impossible for anyone to do anything about some of the odd placements. But it also makes it really interesting because she hung the art in a way that's very personal, and we might not understand why it's put like that, but in her head she just had these ideas about the art and these relationships with the art that led her to think that this would be good placement. So even though it's kind of weird, it's also kind of like walking around in the mind of someone who lived 100 years ago, and it can be interesting to try and figure out, well, what was she thinking that made her want to place things like this? So I'll be talking about the portrait of Isabella Stewart Gardener herself, painted by John Singer Sargent. So who's been to the public library around here? A few of you, and a few of you said you'd been to the MFA. So if you've been to the library or the MFA, you've definitely already seen artwork by John Singer Sargent, because he did those big murals on the ceilings of both the MFA and the library. And if you're in the public library, you walk up the stairs and make a left. There's this big room with dark wood paneling and all these paintings, and he painted those as well. So just again, take a look at this painting. I think it's very different from the other two, even though it was actually painted in the exact same year as Van Gogh's self-portrait. But what do you think that Sargent is interested in saying about Isabella Stewart Gardener here, and how is it different or similar to the other two paintings, and how does he go about saying these things? So just talk to one another about what you think for a couple of minutes. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, I'll have directions up at the end. I've took some shots of Google Maps, so it'll be easy, yeah.
So you're going to mention the scandal as part of this space?
I am. Okay, so let's find out what's this painting actually saying, and what did it mean to people at the time that it was painted. So I think first it's important just to talk about who Isabella Stewart Gardener was, because she was such an unusual lady. She might even be considered kind of unusual by today's standards, so by late 19th century Boston standards, she was just completely out there. But kind of the person that you love to gossip about, you don't want to associate with, but you're kind of obsessed with talking about anyway. That's who she was to these old Boston ladies who didn't really think that she was very proper most of the time. So she grew up rich. She was actually descended from British royalty. If you've heard of like Mary, Queen of Scots, the Stuarts, she was descended from them distantly. And she married one of Boston's most eligible bachelors, Jack Gardner, and they had a child together who actually died when he was quite young. And she became very depressed and very unhappy for a while until she, on a doctor's recommendation, took a long, large trip through Europe with her husband, which completely reawakened her, really re-energized her, and that's when she developed her interest in collecting European art. So as I said, she really didn't conform to the typical standards of a wealthy Bostonian woman. There are stories of her, and they may be true and they may be not, but there's stories of her doing things like walking a lion around the Fenway, which would be pretty scary, actually, I think, if you were down in Fenway and saw someone walking a lion. But as she always liked to say, why spoil a good story with the truth? So she didn't really mind people talking about her, making up crazy things about her. She just didn't really care. She was actually known as Mrs. Jack because people saw her as being kind of masculine, and she behaved more like a man should back in the late 19th century. So she loved the Red Sox, she loved Harvard sports, and she actually learned jujitsu. So just picture this woman for a second doing jujitsu. It seems really strange, but I don't know if she wore a dress when she was doing it or what. But she was kind of shunned by Boston matrons in the society. So instead, she surrounded herself with authors and musicians and, most of all, artists. So John Singer Sargent was a very famous portrait painter in Europe, but while he was in Europe, he painted this portrait called Madame X, and it caused a big scandal. People thought it was really inappropriate, and you can see, I mean, that would be a lot of skin to be showing for the late 1900s, and a provocative pose that people would have really thought was not decent for him to paint or for this woman to be posing for. So it caused a big scandal, although eventually the scandal just made him more famous. But initially, to get away from all the talk, he moved to America. So he was born in America but raised in Europe and didn't come back to America really until after this scandal. So initially, he only had a couple commissions painting these old ladies in America, which wasn't a whole lot of fun, I can imagine. But then Isabella Stewart Gardener decided that she wanted him to paint her portrait. So she paid him $3,000, and they met up, and she kind of tried to order him around a little bit, and he was very well known for being quite strict with his sitters and not letting them do anything that they chose, only that he chose, but she would push right back. So he found her actually quite irritating as a sitter, even though they developed a pretty close relationship. And once again, after he revealed his painting of Isabella Stewart Gardener, he became a topic of gossip. So Boston society responded to this painting with scandal. They thought that it was too sensual and showed off, again, too much skin because her plunging neckline and her bare arms was a lot of skin for people. So it actually even had a nickname, this painting. It was called Woman, the Enigma, which is like a mystery. So people really looked at it and thought that she seemed both scandalous and mysterious. And it was actually only even shown in public once for the initial unveiling, when John Singer Sargent showed off many of his paintings in America. But after that one time when it caused so much talk, Isabella Stewart Gardener's husband actually ordered that the painting not be shown again in public until after her death. So it was initially revealed in 1888, but not shown again until after 1924. It was only kept private for Isabella Stewart Gardener herself. So again, that really, I think, Woman the Enigma, calling it a mystery, is very appropriate for this hidden painting. And currently, if you go to the third floor in the Gothic room, what's called the Gothic room in the Isabella Stewart Gardener Museum, that's where it hangs. So it's with a lot of other religious art, which I think is appropriate because there is something sort of religious seeming about this painting. So what in the painting can kind of reveal to us a bit of this story? Well, first of all, I think everyone notices the really intricate background. It's actually a piece of cloth that was hung behind Isabella Stewart Gardener. And if you notice here, it kind of looks like a little crown. Whoops! These things. I'm not going to touch it again, but it kind of looks like a little crown in the way that the pattern sits on her head, which is appropriate because she was called the Queen of Boston sometimes. So it kind of refers to how famous she was in this society. And we were just talking about a halo. It also kind of looks like a halo if you think about Renaissance art and the big gold circles behind the heads. It kind of almost makes her into a religious looking figure. And like we were looking at in the portrait of Nicholas Boylston, the clothing is really revealing, and in this case, a little too revealing, too much skin. But black would have been a really odd color for a woman to be wearing outside of a funeral in the late 19th century. It would have been kind of indecent for a woman to wear black. And she had a very extensive wardrobe full of all these super fancy and expensive clothes, so it's a little strange that she posed in this dress. But really the clothing just emphasizes both, I think, the mystery in the painting and the scandal, and that it was maybe painted with a little intent to cause some scandal. And if we go back to the larger painting, you can see the string of pearls that's been hung around her waist. So that both emphasizes kind of the curves of her body, which people didn't really respond to too well, but also the fact that when she traveled to Europe, her husband would add new pearls to this string for every visit they made. So it's actually a reference to her as a collector to be able to see these pearls that show off her trips to Europe to bring back art to this museum. And here's this is the more typical looking portrait by John Singer Sargent. This would have been a very proper portrait, and you see that what she's wearing is not at all like Isabella Stewart Gardener's outfit here, and the overall impressions that are given are very different. So that's the end of the lecture. I just wanted to include some maps so that if you guys thought this was interesting or would be interested in going to any of these museums, make it as easy as possible. Although, like I said, the Fogg Museum is closed right now for renovation, but if you're here in 2014, you'll be able to go back. It sounds like a long way away, but we're not that far from 2014. So the MFA is open Saturday through Tuesday from 10 to 4:45 and Wednesday through Friday from 10 to 9:45. It costs $25 for adults, $23 for students. Although because I went to BU, I could go for free. And the Isabella Stewart Gardener Museum is open on Monday through Wednesday, 11 to 5, and Thursday, 11 to 9, and closed on Tuesdays, so don't try and go on Tuesday. But you can see that here's the T, this is the E line. So you just, coming from EC, you come down this way and get off at the MFA stop. And all you have to do, here's the stop, here's the museum. You should be able to see it as soon as you get off. So it's really easy. You just walk up and in, and there you are in this wonderful museum that has all different kinds of art. So if you're not interested in European or American art, they've got Asian art, they've got African art, they've got ancient Greek art, all different kinds of things. And it's just a really beautiful building too. And the Isabella Stewart Gardener Museum, very similar. You get off at the MFA stop. Here's the MFA, but instead of walking that way, you walk up this street, and there you go. It's as easy as that. Just go to the museum. And once the Fogg Museum reopens, you'll be able to get to it by getting off at the Harvard Square T stop on the red line. And you can go around like this, but I have the directions pointing this way because I think it's more interesting to walk through the main gate called Johnson Gate at Harvard and through the Harvard campus, which is really pretty, and you can get to the museums that way. And like I said, they have another museum called the Peabody Museum that has all this these natural sciences, things like fossils and not stuffed animals, but real stuffed animals. It's called taxidermy. So I hope that you take a visit while you're here and that you've learned more about Boston museums, and thank you all for coming.